How can you know if the market is big enough for your dream to become a coffee roaster? According to coffeebean.com and Zippia, there could be anywhere from 1,400 to 3,200 coffee roasters in the United States. That tells you that there's a lot of demand for coffee, enough to support all of these roasters. If you're wanting to determine how big the market is for specialty coffee roasting, then this video is for you. I'm going to walk through the process of researching and calculating the market size in terms of what's called the TAM-SAM-SOM. That's the total available market, the serviceable addressable market, and the serviceable obtainable market. This is a technique for figuring out how big the market is and making sure that the market is big enough for you to be successful and help you decide whether this is the right venture for you. Let's get into it. Market sizing is one of the more challenging skills for entrepreneurs to master, and yet it can be so important to make sure that there's a big enough market to make it worthwhile to launch a new venture, whatever it is. The TAM-SAM-SOM model is a way to calculate how big the market is and really make sure you're entering a market that has room for your business to be successful. The TAM is the total available market. This is all the money that's spent in a large category that relates to your business. Think of it as the largest general category that you would fit into. So for coffee roasters, this could be the total market for coffee in general. How much is being spent on coffee? And so you're really looking at the larger picture. So when you see industries where billions or even tens of billions of dollars are spent, it lets you know that there's definitely a market generally for the product. But what you want to do is really zoom in a lot closer to see what's the market that's going to affect your particular business. This is where the SAM, or the Serviceable Addressable Market, can be very helpful in determining all the money that's being spent today, more specifically on the types of product that you sell. So where you might look at the total available market to be something like how much is spent on coffee in the United States, the serviceable addressable market might be how much is spent buying coffee beans or roasted coffee beans in the United States. And then, of course, the serviceable obtainable market is getting in even closer to who are the customers in this space that are spending money today that you could actually go and turn into one of your customers. Ultimately, this more closely defined circle of customers and spending that occurs is more likely to be the kind of market that you could gain a share of, or even a meaningful share of. Too many times, market sizing is reduced to a Google search where someone does a search, finds a number of something that's being spent, and then reports that in their pitch decks or discussions with investors as the total available market. When in reality, that can be very deceiving because it's looking at a very, very large number, but isn't taking into account the things that are very specific about the business that's being launched or proposed. In fact, many business models and pitches will even ignore market sizing altogether. What that means is the entrepreneur is then really leaning on a kind of a model that says, I'm going to make these exact sales on this kind of an adoption curve. And that draws a lot more scrutiny. And it also points to the fact that they're really trying to build a business that's very derivative of others that exist. If you're trying to launch a startup where you think there's more to the business model than would be the normal approach, something more innovative or has the ability to grow faster, it's helpful to look at the size of the market and point to the fact that you're going to innovate in that space. You're really looking to the larger view of the market to tell you where there's opportunities that you can capitalize on for your proposed venture. The TAM-SAM-SOM model is often represented as three concentric circles. The largest circle represents the total available market, all the money that's being spent in that market and that frame on that kind of a product. The middle circle is the serviceable addressable market. This represents a subset of that total available market that's more focused on the types of products or offerings that you have. And then the serviceable obtainable market represents the customers and purchases within that space that are really closely related to what you do, to the point that you expect you could convert those customers and those sales into your own revenue streams. Let's take a deeper dive on each one of these. So the total available market represents all of the money that's being spent in the largest industry segment that's relevant to your startup. So you're going to want to choose your geography based on where you think you're most likely to have success. If you want to target a national market, you would look at the entire country in terms of how much is being spent annually in this category. Or you might just want to gain a dominant position in your immediate region so you could zoom in accordingly. Let's also talk for a minute about what's called the compound annual growth rate, or sometimes called the CAGR. In the total available market, if you can also calculate the compound annual growth rate in that industry, and oftentimes there's industry research that will tell you what this is, that gives you an idea of whether or not that industry is growing or receding, whether it's growing a lot or a little bit. This CAGR can help to tell you if you're entering a market that's getting bigger naturally, because if it is, that means there's even more opportunity for you to capture some of that new growth and not have to wrestle that away from existing providers in that space. So being able to calculate this compound annual growth rate, or the CAGR, or at least being able to know how to look for this type of data to support your business case, can be really helpful. Taking a deeper dive at the serviceable addressable market, once you've determined the total spend in your category, it helps to get more specific about the type of customer that you're interested in and targeting, and also the value proposition that you've identified that you're going to bring to this type of a customer. This will help you to identify what portion of the market you can potentially service as a new entrant, but also which parts of it are a little bit out of your reach, at least for now. So that brings us to the serviceable obtainable market, and this is the final category, the segment of that serviceable addressable market that you realize you can reasonably bring value to the customers and actually get some of the dollar spent in that category with your product. This is money that's spent for the exact product and value proposition that you can deliver to customers that you can reach. In theory, every dollar that's spent in this category could be one that you have a shot at getting. Ideally, in time, you would want to capture a meaningful percentage of this serviceable obtainable market. Sometimes it's even described as market share. So now that we understand what TAM, SAM, and SOM is, let's take a look at an example for a coffee roaster business. Along the way, we'll look at how the research data was collected and how the numbers were computed. Let's say, as an example, you're wanting to produce a high-quality craft roast that appeals to coffee aficionados. You might approach it this way. For this example, I've defined the total available market as the annual spend in the United States on coffee production. This covers lots of different categories, but what I've done is I've used market research data and studies to help me determine what was spent in 2021 all the way through what's projected in 2025. Using the different studies to give me an idea of the range of each of these time frames. Ultimately, it will allow me to also calculate the compound annual growth rate. As you can see here, I've found that about $85 billion was spent in this category in 2021, and at present, projections for 2025 are in the neighborhood of $135 billion. This means that the compound annual growth rate is about 10%. Let's take a quick look at how that was calculated. I'd like to pause for a moment here to talk about the compound annual growth rate for this total available market. It's important to understand whether the market is growing or receding, and you need to calculate that compound annual growth rate. Many times when you're doing research, the studies will have done this for you, and so that you have the ability to do it. And if you're not inclined to do the math, or you're not doing your own research, you probably can take that at face value. But I just want to explain real briefly how this is calculated so you understand what's happening. Essentially, the compound annual growth rate is looking at the value of the industry at a beginning period and also an ending period. So if you look at the course of a year or a multi-year window, you look at what the value is at the beginning of that period and the end of that period, and you run this calculation to figure out, is it growing, is it receding? And so if the number is 0, the calculation is flat. But if it's positive, that tells you the market is growing, the CAGR is positive. If it's a negative amount, if the CAGR is negative, that shows you the amount being spent in that category is getting smaller each year. It is much easier to enter a business that's growing every year because you're not necessarily having to displace some of the current business. You have the opportunity to actually capture some of the new business that's coming in. And so it's much better to enter a growing business than a receding one. And even one that is around 0 is telling you that it's not growing a whole lot. You're really going to have to get in there and compete against incumbent providers that can be very different. Ideally, you want a business opportunity that's growing, an industry that's growing in terms of that compound annual growth rate. So as you can see here, the formula is calculated like this. You take the ending value of the period in terms of dollars or revenue spent, and then you divide that by the beginning value. So if you're doing a 5-year period, you would take the money spent at the beginning value of that period and really divide that into the ending value period. And then you're going to raise that to the power of 1 divided by the number of periods. So if you're doing a number of years, you would do it that way. You could do it by months. And there's also -1. So that's the formula. So looking at it in terms of this total available market, we're taking the 135 billion, which is the ending value, divided by 85 billion, which is the beginning value. And then we're raising that to the power of 1 over 5 years minus 1. So you can see the math plays out here. 1.58824 raised to the power of 0.01666667 minus 1, or about 10%. And again, don't need to get wrapped up in the math if this is not your cup of tea, but this is how it's being calculated and determined whether this is a growth market and how big the growth is. Looking here at almost a 10% growth rate tells us that there's enough growth happening that you can feel good about the fact that you're entering a market that's growing, and you can be successful in this market if you can provide a differentiated product and value proposition to your target customers. So in this case, I've designed the total available market as annual spending on coffee production in the United States. So we've looked at a very, very large industry category to represent the total available market. It may be better to actually zoom in closer if you're doing this for a small business startup and looking for capital that way. But looking at it more broadly, you have the opportunity to present this as a startup that could turn into a national brand. Doing some research in terms of data about this industry, I've looked to companies like Statista, North Star Roast, and Forbes to present data, market research data on this view of how much is being spent nationally on coffee production. Based on that, I've calculated an amount between 85 billion and 134 billion. So looking at different sources, you'll find different numbers. And this is why it's important not to just do one Google search and take the first one at face value. I've used 3 different sources here that have done extensive research and identified market spend, and I've created a range representing this particular number. If you were going for large amounts of capital, you would even research this more extensively, looking for every study that's been done in recent years to help define how much is spent in this category. You might even do your own primary research to dig in and find out whether the numbers that are being presented in some of these secondary research studies are accurate, or if maybe they're missing something, or they're framed in a little bit different way that don't quite fit your purposes. But in most cases, if you can prove it for the total available market, that there is a lot of good evidence and data supporting the amount of money being spent in that area, you can feel pretty good that that's going to give you an idea of this largest circle, the total available market. The serviceable addressable market is where you start to look at subsets within that data. And this is where having multiple data sources, research studies, and so forth can be helpful, because some studies may not give you the level of detail or granularity that you need, while others may have a lot of data along these lines. The SAM, the serviceable addressable market, should be a subset of the total available market. So once you've set that total available market, you can start to look to the data that's available that also gives you insight into the range of spending that occurs in that tighter circle, in the more specific type of products or services that you plan to offer. So in this case, we've looked at the serviceable available market as traditional coffee, but specifically the gourmet coffee industry. Most of the research studies broke down the results of the total spend into different categories. And there's a whole category for gourmet coffee in the traditional roasting style. And so within that, about 13% of the total coffee market is represented in this traditional coffee roaster gourmet style area. So about 11 billion to 17 billion being spent in the United States each year in this serviceable addressable market. So what we have here is a subset where we can see those that are going to buy in this category are different from those that are just looking for run-of-the-mill coffee beans, just want their morning cup of coffee. The next level down, we start to get very specific about the type of coffee bean, not just gourmet roasted coffee, but in this case, for the serviceable obtainable market, we're looking for customers that are really buying the kind of product you're going to deliver that you would hope and aspire to be able to draw to your product. In this case, I've identified a subcategory called third wave coffee. So this is highly specialized coffee. This is craft production, small batch production. It's really much more in line with the type of business that you would be, especially as a startup coffee roaster. You're going to need to differentiate from all of coffee, but also even within gourmet coffee to this very specialized area. There's already a lot of players here. There's already a lot of competition here. But if you can become recognized as a third wave coffee roaster with a unique and specialized product, now you have an obtainable market, a group of customers and products that are very specialized in what it is that they're buying. And you can now come to that group and say, I have something that's as specialized as the products that you're buying today. So in this case, through the research, particularly NorthstarRoast.com had some nice data to support the fact that about 5% of that serviceable addressable market is being captured today with this third wave coffee type of a category. About $550 to $870 million a year spent in the United States in this category. That's still, it's a much more concise view of who the customer is and what's being spent. But also you can see here, even with a good bit of competition, a lot of money being spent in this category, hundreds of millions of dollars. So that means that there is a fertile market to be addressed, particularly if you can really become part of this specialized group of products that are and offerings that are out there. What I've done here is I've started to bring in a bottom-up analysis of what's practical for a business over the next, say, 5 years. So what we've done here is we've started to create some financial projections from the bottom up, starting with how much coffee could you actually produce? If the first roaster that you buy has a particular capacity, you can start to determine how much coffee you could produce. So in this case, a coffee roaster was selected that could produce, if it was running at full capacity 24 hours a day throughout the year, $2.56 million worth of coffee in terms of sales revenue. So what we've done here is we've identified, well, if the roaster started small with just one device to produce the coffee, there's a capacity on that device. And so bottom up, we're assuming that there's an upper limit on how much that could be produced. But there's also assumptions built in here about how much can be sold. And so the assumption is this much coffee can be produced and sold. And so this is a blend of those two things, representing about $2.5 million could be produced and sold by this business as part of that serviceable obtainable market. And of course, we would start to work through each of the other rings in terms of how this business could be grown, perhaps by multiple roasters, staff that could work around the clock, and all those kinds of things. But for the purposes of this video, I'll stop there, but it's giving you an idea of how you might start to work from the bottom up in the same way we work from the top down in terms of figuring out the size of the market. Ultimately, what this model is showing from a top down and starting from the bottom up, if you're wanting to launch a coffee roaster business, there is a market there for that. What you want to do now is test your own individual capacity to tap into that market with things like perhaps social media campaigns or some kind of a vlog that would help to draw potential audience members in to see if there's interest in you as a roaster and your business specifically as you develop your product. Now for an example of actually finding this data that you'll use to calculate your total available market and some of the others. I'm just going to show a few examples where I've gone to resources like Statista that will provide you with data and market research. And so you can do the search on your industry that you're interested in and start to pull the data. You'll look for research studies that will give you not just an overarching summary of the data, but actually shows you the detail of that data. Another really good source of data to support your model would be the US Census Bureau that can tell you about the number of people that live in a population, the income levels, and so forth. This could also be helpful depending on the type of coffee business that you're launching. If a coffee roaster you're trying to launch regionally, having some data about the demographics of the people that live in that area might be helpful. You can also use larger industry sources like IBIS World that will provide you with research studies about money that's being spent, how it's being spent, who the customers are, and how much it's growing or receding in any given period of time. Of course, this initial TAM-SAM-SOM calculation is just a drip in your cup, but it gives you a foundation on the process for researching and calculating the size of your market for the coffee roaster business. It is important to do your own research, but what this example shows is that there's a vast and growing market for enterprising coffee roaster founders who have a passion, the grit, and the determination to make it happen. You don't have to beat all of the roasters in the market today, only a few. Keep going.